Okay, so it's one of the most dramatic reforms in the nomination process in U.S. party history. Wisconsin, again, among the first to do it. The direct primary was adopted as part of a series of progressive era reforms in the early 20th century at the particular urging of that guy, Robert La Follette, who was elected governor of Wisconsin in 1900, later served as a U.S. Senator, became one of the most outspoken and articulate advocates for progressive causes in the first quarter of the 20th century. The direct primary itself was argued would help to weaken party organizations. As in Wisconsin, as in many Midwestern and Western states at the time, the parties were widely seen as being dominated by a number of very wealthy industries, and in this case it was the railroad and logging industries. If the direct primary would pass, he and others argued, it would free up legislators to be able to make up their own minds about things, to depolarize, to represent their constituents in a more effective and fair way. Now, looking back at some of the speeches given, both from opponents and proponents of the direct primary, you see sort of similar themes. Both of them seem to think that this would actually be very destructive for the party system. So La Follette, when he was making his arguments, said that under the direct primary, quote, "No longer will there stand between the voter and the elected official a political machine with a complicated system of caucuses and conventions, by the easy manipulation of which it thwarts the will of the voter." Okay. On the other side, a prominent stalwart Republican, Emanuel Philip, who would later serve as governor, he was examining the state of Wisconsin politics under the direct primary a few years after it had been implemented. And as he argued, the names Republican and Democrat have no real meaning in Wisconsin today. Even the members of Congress make their own platforms and stand on them, there being no conventions of party representatives to perform that duty. Every member of Congress is a party by himself. Okay, so progressives and stalwarts don't agree on much, but they do agree this reform seems to matter, or it should matter. It does seem to have this major deleterious effect on partisanship. So what might we expect to see if we could actually examine this? Well, one, we should expect to see that under the direct primary, party discipline somehow gets undermined. That is, maybe the parties depolarize somewhat. They move closer together. The parties might become less internally coherent. Okay, that is, if there's less discipline on them, you might see a wider range of voting behavior within each party. Similarly, we might expect to see improved representation, okay, where under the direct primary, legislators more closely adhere to what their constituents want. To examine these questions, I was able to collect a whole bunch of a whole bunch of roll call votes from members of the Wisconsin Assembly, the lower house, the lower chamber in Wisconsin, between 1895 and 1911. With the help of a graduate student, Keith Poole, I was able to translate all these into ideal points, DW nominate scores that you can model over time. I also collected a number of county-level political and demographic indicators. This is not perfect. Obviously, these members are representing their districts, not necessarily counties. There's a lot of overlap there, but they're not quite perfect, but close. And just to give you an idea of what these scores look like over time, these are the median ideal points by party, and that vertical line there shows when the direct primary was implemented. It was passed in 1904, was enacted in time for the 1906 election cycle, so I've drawn that line in 1905. I have a lot more confidence in the aggregate Republican statistics than the Democratic ones, simply because there were so few Democrats in the chamber at this time. It was really never more than 20 members of a 100-member chamber during this time period. But we see the the median Republican ideal point, more or less hovering the same. It gets slightly more toward the extremes over time. Once the direct primary gets implemented, it doesn't depolarize. The Republicans stay at least as extreme on that dimension as they were before, and in fact, toward the end, it looks like they're actually moving more toward the extremes. The Democrats seem to be depolarizing somewhat going into the direct primary, but then after its passage, actually move away from the Republicans. Another way of looking at the same is just to take the difference between these two, the inter-party median distance. And again, you see slight depolarization before the direct primary is implemented. Once it's implemented, the parties move apart again. Okay, this is really inconsistent with what we would expect to see. That the parties are actually becoming more disciplined under the direct primary. Similarly, we can look at the standard deviation of ideal points to get some ideas of party cohesion. Again, focusing mainly on the Republicans here, we see the Republican ideal points mostly holding steady going into the direct primary. Once it's implemented, their standard deviation drops considerably. They actually are giving evidence of being a more ideologically cohesive party rather than less so. So definitely some evidence here of parties becoming stronger, interestingly, under the direct primary. Also taking a little cut to look at representation. Again, this is a very rough take here, but in this scatter plot on the horizontal axis I have the county level Republican share of the presidential vote in 1900. I'm comparing that with legislators' first dimension ideal point. They're both basically coded in the Republican direction, so this is, districts that are very Democratic to very Republican, and member behavior that is very Democratic to very Republican. And what we see is essentially, some measure of representation here. As a district becomes more Republican, it's more likely to be represented by a Republican, and the more Republican it gets, the more Republican the voting behavior of those legislators is. So there's both some representation at the individual district level and within the parties. Flash forward 10 years to life under the direct primary, we have the same sort of setup here, and representation has kind of died. So here are members from very competitive districts and members from very Republican districts. They're voting more or less the same way as each other, okay? They're largely ignoring individual constituent sentiment and voting in just a very consistent way with their party. Okay, so we had all these nice predictions that seem to just sort of fall by the wayside here. Nothing really worked. And why? Why might we see no real effect? Well, for one, we know that parties are pretty skilled at getting what they want, even in primary elections. Okay, first of all, the people who turn out to vote in primaries tend to already be pretty party-loyal people, even if you open it up to moderates and independents. But also, we know that parties have this ability to signal to voters through the use of endorsements and campaign money who is a good member of this party and who is not, and to give a lot of advantages to other people. If you look at also Alan Ware's book from 2002 on the implementation of the direct primary, he argues that actually party leaders really liked the direct primary. They didn't see it as some major threat. It actually solved some problems they were having and allowed the state to come in and designate who the nominee was. They found that actually very useful. Another thing to think about is that reform may just be machined by another name. If you read Jessica Traunstein's 2008 book on party organizations, she finds that machine systems and reform systems are really just two sides of the same coin. What they tend to do is they seek certain benefits when they're in office for the people who help put them in office, and to deprive those same benefits to others. And they also try and skew the election rules a little bit to make it easier for their supporters to have their say heard. And we see really an example of just this sort of thing in Wisconsin, where La Follette was pushing for reform that advantaged people like him in the party nomination process, people who were very articulate and persuasive public speakers, and not necessarily great in the backroom dealings. And so he got that kind of reform that brought more people like him into power. Also, La Follette, turns out, was a pretty strong party leader. He was kind of a real party boss once he got in power. A lot of Republicans were terrified of him, which might help to explain why you see party discipline actually increasing. Finally, this is just yet another example of party reforms tending not to work. Party demanders tend to be these very creative very creative and industrious people who are always trying to influence public policy. They don't go away just because the election or nomination rules